The coffee maker sputtered its last drops into a chipped mug that had long since lost its handle on one side, leaving a raw ceramic edge that Grayson Merritt had learned to hold just right so it wouldn't cut his palm. He stood at the kitchen counter of their two-room apartment in Harlan, Kentucky, watching the October darkness press flat against the window above the sink. It was 11:43 at night. His shirt still smelled like the diner fried oil and burnt coffee, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had been on his feet for 9 hours straight. He should have been asleep. Owen was asleep, curled under a blanket on the pull-out couch, because the second bedroom had a mold problem along the baseboard that Grayson hadn't been able to afford to fix. The landlord had stopped returning calls in August. The ceiling in the bathroom had developed a stain the shape of a spreading hand, and every time Grayson stood under it to shower, he thought about the weight of the water sitting above him in the floor of whoever lived upstairs. He was thinking about none of that when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers at this hour were never anything good. Collection agencies ran late shifts, and there were two medical bills from Elaine's final hospitalization that had been cycling through collection for 14 months. But something made him pick up. Some instinct he couldn't have named. The voice on the other end was measured and formal, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who delivered difficult news for a living and had learned to smooth all the edges off it. "Mr. Merritt, my name is Douglas Farwell. I'm a probate attorney based in Lexington. I'm sorry to reach you at this hour, but I've been trying to get through for several days. I'm calling about your grandfather, Clifford Merritt. He passed away on the 14th of this month. I'm sorry for your loss." Grayson set the coffee mug down very carefully on the counter. Clifford Merritt. The name came up from somewhere deep and mostly sealed, like opening a door in a house you'd lived in long enough to forget some of the rooms. Grayson had been 12 years old the only time he'd met the man. A summer afternoon somewhere in eastern Kentucky, a drive his mother had insisted on, and his father had not come along for. He remembered a tall man with large, careful hands and very still eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to be measuring something invisible. He remembered a workshop that smelled like machine oil and sawdust. He remembered being handed a small metal device and being told to hold it near a lamp, and then watching the lamp flicker without anyone touching the switch. He had not thought about that afternoon in years. "Mr. Merritt, are you there?" "I'm here," Grayson said. "What does this mean for me specifically?" The attorney exhaled slowly. "Your grandfather left a will. You are the sole beneficiary. He left you a property, a farmhouse, and approximately 15 acres of land in Harlan County. I should tell you up front, Mr. Merritt, that the property comes with some complications. There are 3 months of back property taxes owed. The county assessor has flagged the structure as uninhabitable pending inspection, and there are no liquid assets, no savings, no accounts, just the land and what's on it." Grayson looked at the total in his checking account, which he had memorized that afternoon, because memorizing it had become a habit, the way you kept checking a bruise to see if it had gotten worse. $347. He had a shift at the diner the next morning starting at 6. Owen needed new shoes. The left sole had separated from the upper, and Grayson had been pressing it back down with electrical tape every morning for the past 2 weeks, hoping the boy wouldn't notice, knowing he had. "How much are the back taxes?" Grayson asked. The attorney told him. Grayson was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be in touch," and hung up before the man could say anything else. He stood at the counter until the coffee went cold. Then he walked to the pull-out couch and stood looking at his son sleeping. Owen was small for 9 with his mother's coloring and her way of sleeping with one hand open beside his face, as though ready to catch something. Elaine had been dead for 3 years. The cancer had taken 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and it had taken everything else, the savings, the house they'd been renting, with the option to buy the future that had looked, if not easy, at least possible. Grayson had paid the last of the medical debt in February. The victory had felt like nothing at all. He thought about Clifford Merritt's hands, the way they had moved over that metal device with a kind of quiet authority, like a man describing something in a language he'd spoken since birth. He did not sleep that night. The following morning, he dropped Owen at school and went directly to the county assessor's office. then to the courthouse, then to a copy shop where he printed everything he could find about the Merritt property, using the courthouse's public access terminal. He sat in his truck in the parking lot afterward and read through it all twice. The farmhouse had been built in 1952 on land that had been in the Merritt family since before the Second World War. Clifford had lived there alone since his wife passed in 1994. The property taxes had lapsed in the final years of his life. The county had sent notices. There was no record of response. Grayson drove to the diner, worked his shift, and said nothing to anyone about any of it. 3 days later, he received a different kind of call. Warren Aldrich had a voice like money, not flashy money, but old money, the kind that had been sitting in the same accounts long enough to develop weight and gravity. He introduced himself as Elaine's father, which was technically accurate and also entirely unnecessary since Grayson had known the man for 7 years, had sat across from him at Thanksgiving tables and Christmas dinners, and the particular misery of Elaine's memorial service, where Warren had managed to look both grief-stricken and faintly disapproving at the same time. "We'd like you to come in," Warren said. "Sylvia and I, there are some things we'd like to discuss about Owen's situation." "Owen's situation," Grayson repeated. "His living situation, his schooling, his stability." A pause the kind calibrated to let the implied criticism settle. "We're concerned, Grayson. We've been concerned for some time." "I'll come in," Grayson said. "Because what else do you say?" The Aldrich home was in the kind of neighborhood where the driveways were longer than the street, the apartment he and Owen lived on. Warren and Sylvia sat on one side of a table in a dining room that was used. Grayson suspected almost exclusively for meetings like this one. Across from them sat a man Grayson had not expected. Randolph Aldrich was 78 years old and looked like a man who had decided somewhere in his 60s that age was a thing that happened to other people. He was tall, still straight-spined with white hair cut close and eyes the color of February sky pale and offering no warmth whatsoever. He had built Aldrich Holdings from a regional construction company into something that had its hands in energy, real estate, and infrastructure across 4 states. Elaine had spoken about him rarely, and when she did, it was with a carefulness that Grayson had eventually understood was not respect but something more complicated than that. He sat at the head of the table in a room that was not his home, and it still felt like his room. "Sit down, Grayson," Randolph said. Grayson sat. "We've heard about the Merritt property," Randolph said. He didn't explain how. He didn't need to. "I want to be direct with you because I think directness serves everyone better than politeness in situations like this. That land is a burden. The structure is condemned for practical purposes. The soil hasn't been worked in 30 years. You have no capital, no construction experience, and a 9-year-old child who needs stability, not an adventure in rural poverty." Warren cleared his throat softly as though moderating. "What my father-in-law means," Warren said, "is that we want to help. Aldrich Holdings is prepared to offer you $200,000 for the property. Clean title as is, we handle the back taxes. You walk away with real money, enough to give Owen a proper home, proper schooling." Grayson looked at Randolph. Randolph looked back at him with the patience of a man who had never in his life been told no by someone who couldn't afford to say it. "I'll think about it," Grayson said. He drove home, picked Owen up from school, and said nothing about the meeting. That night, after Owen was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote down the number 200,000 on a piece of paper and stared at it for a long time. Then he wrote down 347. Then he wrote down the number the attorney had given him for the back taxes and the number he'd roughly calculated for the minimum repairs the county would require, and the number he owed on his truck, and the number that represented 6 months of rent at their current rate. He looked at all the numbers for a long time. Then he folded the paper and put it in his pocket and went to sleep. 2 days later, he drove out to the Merritt property for the first time. The GPS took him down a county road that narrowed gradually, the pavement giving way to packed gravel, and then to something that was more suggestion than Road 2 tire tracks, through overgrown grass with a center ridge of weeds scraping the undercarriage of his truck. The trees closed in on both sides, October bare, now their branches crossing overhead like fingers. And then the road curved and the farmhouse appeared. He sat in the truck for a full minute before getting out. It was worse than he'd imagined and better than he'd feared, and both of those things were true simultaneously in a way that was hard to explain. The roof sagged in two distinct places along the ridgeline, and the front porch had lost three of its support posts, leaving one corner tilting at an angle that made the whole structure look like a man leaning on a bad knee. Several windows were boarded. The barn to the left had partially collapsed, its far wall folded inward, the roof above it pancaked down at an angle that let in the sky. But the stone foundation was solid. The chimney visible above the roof line stood straight, and the walls beneath the peeling paint and the dark water stains and the general ruin of 30 years of deferred maintenance were thick and true, built by someone who understood that a house was only as good as what held it up. Owen had come with him. He told the school it was a family day, which was not entirely a lie. The boy climbed out of the truck and walked toward the house with the careful, deliberate steps of someone approaching something that needed to be taken seriously. He pressed one palm flat against the stone foundation. He looked up at the sagging roofline. He walked the perimeter of the porch without stepping on it, testing nothing, just looking. Then he turned and said, "The bones are good, Dad." Grayson didn't say anything, but something in his chest moved. Behind the farmhouse, partially hidden by an overgrowth of sumac and volunteer cedar, stood a separate structure. Smaller than the house, built from the same stone with a slate roof that had shed some tiles but otherwise held its shape remarkably well. A workshop. The door was fitted with a padlock that had developed a skin of rust over decades, but the shackle was still solid. Among the items in the estate packet the attorney had sent was a single key on a plain ring with no label. Grayson tried it in the padlock. It opened on the first attempt. He pushed the door inward. Cool air moved past him, carrying the smell of machine oil, cedar shavings, and something else he couldn't name, something metallic and faintly electrical, like the air after a thunderstorm. He reached for the wall inside the door and found a light switch. Clicked it. A single bulb in a porcelain fixture mounted to the ceiling came on. The workshop was larger than the exterior suggested. Workbenches ran along three walls, fitted with pegboards above them, on which tools hung in careful arrangement, each one traced in pencil on the board behind it, so you could see at a glance what was there and what was missing. Nothing was missing. Everything was exactly in its traced outline, placed there by hands that had put things back where they belonged every time for decades as a matter of discipline or devotion or both. Owen moved along the nearest bench, his fingertips hovering just above the surface without touching it, the way you move through a museum when you've been told not to touch, but can't quite stop yourself from almost touching. Grayson stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. On the far wall beneath a canvas tarp secured with two wooden clothespins was something the size and approximate shape of a large chest freezer built from metal and wood, with a care that was visible even under the covering. Grayson left it alone for now. He was not ready for that. On the central workbench, weighted down at its corners by metal blocks, was a large sheet of paper covered in handwriting and diagrams. The handwriting was small and precise, the diagrams rendered with a technical exactness that suggested someone who had done this thousands of times, not sketching, but recording the way you write down something true so it cannot be argued with later. At the top of the sheet, in slightly larger letters, Clifford James Merritt, Harlan County, Kentucky, November 2019. And below that, a single line that Grayson read 3 times before he understood it. "If you are reading this, you are the one I was waiting for." He did not move for a long time. Owen appeared at his elbow, read the line, and said nothing, which was the right response. They drove back to town in the late afternoon, the October light going gold and then orange, and then the particular deep red that eastern Kentucky does better than anywhere else Grayson had ever been. He did not talk about what he'd found. Owen didn't ask. They stopped at the grocery store and bought eggs and bread and a can of soup, and Grayson stood in the cereal aisle for a full 3 minutes, trying to remember what he'd come in for. That night, he called the attorney and told him he was accepting the property. The following morning, before the Aldrich family could find out, he drove to the county tax office and paid the back taxes with his 401k withdrawal, which had been sitting in a pending transfer since the night the attorney had called. The penalty for early withdrawal was going to hurt. He paid it anyway. He had the title transferred to his name by noon. He called the school to arrange Owen's transfer and called the diner to give notice. His manager, a broad woman named Terry, who had never once been unkind to him, looked at him across the pass-through window and said, "You sure about this, Gray?" And he said no, and she nodded like that was the right answer. The move took one afternoon. They didn't have much. Owen carried his own backpack and a box of books. Grayson carried everything else in 4 trips from the truck. They swept the farmhouse floors as best they could, nailed temporary plastic sheeting over the worst of the broken windows, and set up their mattresses in the 2 rooms on the ground floor because the second-floor stairs felt uncertain in a way Grayson wasn't ready to test at night. That was a Thursday. On Friday morning, a white pickup truck with no company markings on the doors pulled into the driveway. The man who got out was somewhere in his late 40s, well-dressed in the particular way of someone who wanted to look casual, but couldn't quite suppress the instinct toward formality. Pressed khakis, leather boots that had never seen mud, a jacket that cost more than Grayson's weekly take-home. He introduced himself as Sterling Vance, a name he offered with the practiced ease of someone who handed out business cards for a living. He represented, he said, Meridian Land Group, a development company with interests in the eastern Kentucky region. He'd heard the property had recently changed hands. He was prepared to make an offer of $200,000 as is, cash close in 30 days. Grayson studied the man for a moment. The property was appraised by the county at $48,000, he said. Sterling Vance smiled in the way that people smile when they are trying to make a number seem reasonable. "We factor in development potential," he said. "Location, acreage, future use." 48 to 200 is a big gap for potential, Grayson said. "We're serious buyers," Sterling Vance said. "We don't waste people's time." "I'll think about it," Grayson said, which was the same thing he'd said to Randolph Aldrich, and which he had not at the time actually meant. This time he meant something different by it. He meant, "I need to understand what you know that I don't." Sterling Vance left a card. Grayson put it on the workshop workbench next to Clifford's notes. 5 days later, Sterling Vance came back. This time the offer was $250,000. Grayson stood on the front porch and let the numbers settle in the air between them. He looked at this man, his clean boots, his careful smile, the slight tension around his eyes that had not been there the first time, and he ran the math that any working man eventually learns to run the math, not of money, but of behavior. You don't raise an offer by 25% in 5 days unless you're afraid of losing something. "Still thinking," Grayson said, and went back inside. That evening, Owen was sitting at the kitchen table working through a math worksheet by lamplight when Grayson came in from the workshop. He'd spent 2 hours that afternoon reading through Clifford's notebooks, not understanding most of the technical content, but understanding the handwriting, the way it stayed controlled, even in the margins, where a man's private thoughts tend to spill, the way the diagrams were labeled, with the patience of someone who expected them to be read by someone else, eventually someone who would need to understand without being there. "Dad," Owen said without looking up, "why do you think Great-Grandpa kept everything in the workshop instead of in the house?" Grayson sat down across from him. "What makes you ask that?" "Because the house was falling down," Owen said. "But the workshop wasn't. He kept the workshop really good, like he was protecting it." Grayson looked at his son for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's right." "What was he protecting it from?" "I don't know yet," Grayson said, "but I'm going to find out." The rain started that night around 10 and came in serious by midnight, the kind of rain that eastern Kentucky mountains funnel down off the ridges with real authority. Grayson heard the first drip from Owen's room at 12:15, a rhythmic tap against the floor, patient and inevitable. He got up, found the flashlight, went to Owen's room. The ceiling above the bed had darkened and was weeping steadily from a seam in the plaster. He moved Owen's mattress to the center of the room and positioned a bucket. Owen slept through the moving. He had always been a deep sleeper, another thing from his mother. Grayson went back to his own room and lay in the dark, listening to the roof absorb the rain, trying to locate by sound all the places where it wasn't holding. He counted 4 distinct drip points before he stopped counting. At 2 in the morning, a sound different from dripping brought him upright. It was a crack, sharp structural, followed by a sliding rush and a thump. He was moving before the sound finished. Owen's room. He pushed the door open and swept the flashlight across the room. A section of the ceiling plaster had given way, a roughly circular collapse about 3 feet across, directly over the spot where Owen's mattress had been. The lath beneath showed through like exposed bone. Water was running freely through the gap, now pooling on the floor, spreading toward the baseboard. Owen had rolled onto his side and was looking at the hole with the calm assessment of a person cataloging damage rather than experiencing fear. "That would have hit me," he said. "Yeah," Grayson said, "but it didn't. Good thing you moved me." "Good thing." Owen sat up. He was wearing a flannel shirt over his pajamas. He'd started doing that after they moved in, layering up against the cold that the old house let in through every gap and creak. He pointed his own small flashlight at the wall, where the plaster had cracked at the edge of the collapse, running his beam along the line of the break, following it down toward the baseboard. "Dad," he said, "this piece is loose." Grayson crossed the room. Owen was pointing to a section of the lower wall, a panel of wooden wainscoting, maybe 2 feet square, that had separated from the surrounding trim by a 1/4 inch along one edge. It was old wood, painted over many times, but Grayson could see that the seam along that edge was different from the other seams. Cleaner, as though it had been fitted to open rather than sealed. He pressed the edge with 2 fingers. The panel moved. He looked at Owen. Owen looked back at him. Grayson got his fingers behind the edge and pulled steadily. The panel swung outward on concealed hinges, smooth and deliberate, the movement of something built to be opened by the right person at the right time. Behind it was a cavity carved into the wall between the studs, deep lined with cedar planks and filled with bundles of papers wrapped in wax cloth and tied with cotton string, the kind of string that had been knotted with the intention of lasting. Grayson sat back on his heels and looked into that space for a long moment. Then he reached in and took out the first bundle. The wax cloth had done its job. The papers inside were dry, the ink as sharp as the day it had been laid down. He set the bundle on the dry section of floor and carefully worked at the knot with his thumbnail until it came loose and the cloth fell open. The top sheet was dated October 1968 and headed in Clifford Merritt's precise hand. Preliminary design notes. Ambient electromagnetic energy collection. System revision 1. Grayson understood maybe 1 word in 5, but he understood enough. He looked at his son. Owen had retrieved 2 more bundles from the cavity and was setting them in a row with careful hands, treating each one like something fragile or sacred, which it was. "Keep going," Grayson said. They worked in the lamplight for 2 hours, extracting bundle after bundle, spreading them across the dry section of floor in the center of the room. Technical drawings, mathematical derivations written out longhand across multiple pages in a continuous argument. Letters from professors at universities MIT Stanford, the University of Illinois, expressing varying degrees of excitement and frustration at Clifford's ideas. Patent correspondence, financial projections, and the journals, 16 of them in sequence filled with observations and calculations and notes to himself and occasional passages that were neither technical nor businesslike. Just a man thinking on paper in the small hours. Owen opened the first journal and found the first page and read the line at the top out loud. "If you found this, you are the one I was waiting for." The same line from the workshop. Grayson reached over and turned to the next page and read it himself. Then the next. The technical content was beyond him for now, but the shape of it was not a man who had spent decades developing something real, something that worked and had chosen to hide it rather than lose it. And who had faith, specific and patient, and apparently undiminished, that someone from his own blood would eventually come to find it. He thought about Clifford's hands, the memory that had surfaced the night the attorney called. The stillness in the man's eyes, The way he had handed that small metal device to a 12-year-old boy and let him hold it near a lamp without explaining anything, as if waiting to see whether the boy would ask the right question. Grayson had asked the wrong one. He'd asked what it was. He should have asked how it worked. He was 34 years old, and it had taken him 22 years to come back, and his grandfather was dead, and the house was leaking in 4 places, and he had a 9-year-old son who had just watched part of his ceiling fall down. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, the rain was easing. The dripping in the bucket had slowed from a rhythm to an occasional comment. The lamplight held steady in the center of the room, and around them on the floor lay 56 years of work laid out in careful paper rows. The next morning broke cold and clear, the way October mornings do in the Kentucky mountains, when the rain has moved through overnight and left the air scoured and honest. Grayson got the wood stove going in the kitchen, and they ate oatmeal standing up because the table had a bad leg. Grayson hadn't fixed yet, and then he sent Owen out to the porch with a book while he went back to Owen's room to look again at the cavity in the wall. He stood in front of it for a long time. He thought about the offer that had doubled in 5 days. He thought about Randolph Aldrich's pale eyes across a dining room table. He thought about the way Sterling Vance had smiled in a way that was meant to look like generosity, but was actually the shape of urgency wearing a gentler mask. He had something they wanted. He did not know yet what it was, but the gap between 48,000 and 250,000 was not explained by development potential. That gap had another name. He just hadn't found it yet. That afternoon, a truck came up the road carrying a casserole dish and a woman who introduced herself as Eugenia Pratt, which she said like someone who had been making introductions for 68 years and had developed a particular method. She was small and direct with iron gray hair, cut practically short, and hands that suggested a life of use. She lived a quarter-mile down the road. She said had been out here long enough to remember when the workshop had heat coming out of it in January and the smell of a running lathe. She came in and set the casserole on the stove and looked around the kitchen with the appraising eye of someone who knew what a place looked like when it was being reclaimed rather than just occupied. "You're Clifford's grandson," she said. Not a question. "I am," Grayson said. "You look like him, around the eyes." She sat down at the table, testing the leg without comment and adjusting her weight accordingly. Cliff was a good man, private but good, the kind of man who'd drive 20 miles at midnight to help a neighbor whose furnace had quit and never mention it again. "Did you know him well?" "Well enough," she said, "well enough to know he was the smartest person in 3 counties and that someone convinced him that being smart made him safe." She paused. It didn't. Grayson sat down across from her. "What happened to him?" Eugenia was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap, then out the window toward the road, and then back at Grayson with the expression of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is deciding whether the moment to put it down has come. "In 1974, she said carefully, "a man came out here from Lexington. Nice suit, nice car. Clifford was excited. He thought he had finally found someone who understood what he had." She stopped. "He signed something that day, and then trucks came a week later and took most of the workshop equipment. And after that, Clifford never smiled quite the same way." "Who was the man?" Grayson asked, though he was already hearing the answer before she said it. Eugenia looked out the window toward the road, the same direction Sterling Vance's pickup truck had come from, the same direction Randolph Aldrich's car would have come from 50 years ago when the road was new and the farmhouse was standing straight, and Clifford Merritt had believed that a handshake from a powerful man meant something. "You already know who," she said. That evening, after Owen had fallen asleep with a journal of Clifford's open on his chest, Grayson went to the workshop alone. He found the device he'd noticed under the canvas tarp on his first visit. He pulled the covering off and stood looking at it in the light of the single overhead bulb. It was the size of a large toolbox constructed from machined aluminum and copper components with hand-wound coils and circuit boards mounted in careful rows inside a hinged case. On its face, a small panel of indicator lights and a single rotary switch, the dial marked with positions labeled in Clifford's hand. He opened the 16th journal to a section marked Proof of Concept Operation Notes and read through the procedure twice. Then he followed it step by step, the way you follow a recipe the first time carefully, without improvising, trusting the person who wrote it. When he turned the rotary switch to the position marked test load, the machine began to hum, quietly, steadily, the sound of something that had been waiting to be told it was time. A string of indicator lights came on in sequence green down the row. Grayson had a single bulb on an extension cord lying on the workbench. He'd been using it while he worked. He connected the cord's stripped end to the terminals indicated in Clifford's notes. Then he stepped back. The bulb came on, not flickered, not struggled, just came on warm and steady as if it had been connected to a wall socket its whole life. Grayson stood in the workshop in the dark Kentucky night and looked at that light for a long time. He heard the workshop door open behind him and didn't turn around because he knew the sound of Owen's footsteps. "Grandpa really did it, didn't he?" Owen said. Not a question. The same tone he'd used when he pressed his hand against the stone foundation on the first day, stating a fact he'd already suspected. "Yeah," Grayson said. "He really did." They stood side by side and looked at the light. Then Grayson's phone rang. He looked at the screen. A Lexington area code. A number he didn't recognize. He picked up. The voice was the same one from the dining room, measured without warmth, carrying the weight of a man who expected to be listened to. "Grayson," Randolph Aldrich said, "be smart about this." Grayson looked at the light burning from a machine that had no business making light, built by a man who had trusted the wrong person and paid for it with 40 years of silence. "Good night, Mr. Aldrich," he said, and ended the call. Outside, the October wind moved through the ridge trees, carrying the smell of coming frost. Inside the workshop, the bulb burned steady and clean, and Grayson Merritt stood beside his 9-year-old son in the light his grandfather had always meant for them to find. The frost came in the night and stayed. Grayson found it on the porch boards the next morning, a thin white skin over everything, and stood in the doorway with his coffee, watching it melt in the early sun, thinking about the call. Randolph Aldrich had not asked a question. He had not made a threat, not technically. He had offered advice in the way that powerful men offer advice, with the full understanding that the advice and the threat are the same sentence. Grayson went back inside and looked at the journals stacked on the kitchen table. He had a decision to make, and he understood that the decision was not about money. It had never been about money, not really. Not from the moment Owen had pressed his hand against the stone foundation and said, "The bones are good." It was about whether a man who had been losing ground for 3 years, a job, a wife, a home, whatever version of the future he'd been building before the cancer came, was capable of choosing to fight for something when fighting made no practical sense. He decided, standing in the kitchen of a house with a collapsed ceiling and 4 drip points and no insulation worth mentioning that he was. He put on his work boots and went to the workshop. The proof of concept device had run through the night. He noted the readings in his log, steady, unchanged, exactly as Clifford's notes predicted, and turned it off to let the components rest the way the operation manual recommended after extended use. Then he sat down at the workbench with the first journal and a legal pad and began to read. Not skimming, reading. The way you read something when you have decided it matters. Clifford's handwriting was small and even compressed, in the way of someone who had learned early that paper was a resource to be managed. The entries were dated, the earliest going back to 1968, and they built on each other the way a long argument builds each page, assuming the truth of what came before, adding to it, revising it, pushing it further. Grayson understood perhaps a third of the technical content on first reading. The mathematics were beyond him, entirely pages of derivations that he recognized as important without being able to follow them. But the underlying logic, the shape of the idea that he could follow, and it was this. Clifford had believed and had spent decades proving to his own satisfaction that the air around any inhabited area was saturated with electromagnetic energy, radio waves, power line emissions, the residual discharge of 100 electrical systems running simultaneously in every direction. Energy that traveled through space was never collected and simply dissipated. What he had built was a system for catching it, not generating it, catching it, the way a rain barrel catches what the sky is already giving away. The implications stated plainly in an entry from 1971 were simple enough that Owen would have understood them. A family that owned one of Clifford's systems would not have an electric bill. Not a reduced bill, not a bill offset by credits, no bill. The power companies would lose a customer permanently, and they would lose them without any ongoing relationship, without any leverage, without any way to bring them back. Grayson wrote that down on the legal pad in plain language and looked at it for a while. Then he went back to reading. He read every morning before Owen woke up and again in the evenings after Owen went to sleep. On the days Owen was in school, he'd enrolled at the county school a mile down the road, a small brick building where the principal had shaken Grayson's hand with both of his and said they were glad to have them. Grayson worked in the workshop, following Clifford's notes, learning the tolerances and behaviors of the proof of concept device, the way you learn an animal's moods. When it hummed at a slightly higher pitch, it meant the collection field was strong. When it dropped to a lower register, it meant interference from somewhere nearby, usually the power line that ran along the county road. He taught himself these things without asking anyone. This was important to him in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. He understood that he would need help eventually, legal help especially, but he wanted to come to that help with something already in his hands. He wanted to understand what he had before he handed it to someone else to evaluate. Clifford had trusted a man with his invention before fully protecting it, and Grayson had spent enough time reading about what that trust had cost to make certain he would not repeat it. At the end of the second week, he drove to the Harlan County Public Library. The librarian was a woman named Marge Dunfield, 55 years old, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular quality of focused attention that belonged to people who had spent their careers helping others find things they didn't know how to look for. Grayson explained what he needed access to the USPTO public database, basic guidance on reading patent filings, and any information she could find on a company called Merit Innovation Group that had filed patents in the early 1970s. Marge looked at him over her glasses. "Is this for a legal matter?" "It might become one," Grayson said. "Then sit down," she said. "This is going to take a while." It took most of the day. Marge walked him through the patent database with the methodical patience of someone who had taught this before and understood that the goal was not to give someone a fish, but to make certain they could find the pond. She showed him how to search by assignee name, how to read the basic structure of a patent filing, how to identify priority dates in continuation applications, and the chain of ownership when a patent changed hands. Merit Innovation Group appeared in the database exactly as Clifford's notes had described. Filed 1971, approved 1973, 3 patents covering different aspects of the ambient electromagnetic collection system, the collection array, the conditioning circuits, and the storage and conversion mechanism. The filings were detailed and precise, the work of someone who understood that a patent's value was directly proportional to how specifically it described what it protected. Then the ownership chain. "There," Marge said, pointing at the screen. 1974. Assignment recorded. Merit Innovation Group to Aldrich Energy Solutions. Grayson looked at the date, looked at the name. "Can you find what Aldrich Energy Solutions did with them after that?" he asked. Marge typed, searched, filtered. It took 20 minutes, and what came up was not a manufacturing record or a product launch or a commercial deployment of any kind. What came up beginning in 1999 and continuing in a steady sequence through to the present was a series of licensing agreements. Aldrich Holdings, the parent company that had absorbed Aldrich Energy Solutions sometime in the mid-1980s, had been licensing the Merit patents to energy companies. Not manufacturing, not developing. Licensing. Selling permission to use Clifford's ideas to companies that then incorporated elements of them into their own products and research. Marge helped him build a rough accounting from the public filings. The licensing fees were not itemized in the USPTO records, but the agreements were listed, and the companies involved were large enough that their own SEC filings sometimes referenced the licensed technology with values attached. Marge pulled 3 of those filings and cross-referenced them. The number she arrived at, written on a yellow legal pad in her precise handwriting and slid across the table to Grayson without comment, was $127 million. Grayson sat in the library chair and looked at that number for a long time. He thought about the apartment with the mold along the baseboard. He thought about Owen's shoes with the sole held down by electrical tape. He thought about Elaine's medical debt, which he had spent 18 months paying off at $200 a month working double shifts, eating whatever was cheapest until it was gone, and the victory had felt like nothing because everything else was gone too. He thought about Randolph Aldrich sitting at the head of someone else's dining room table like he owned it. He wrote down the year 1999 on his own legal pad, added 25 to 1974. The arithmetic was not complicated. He said to Marge, "Can I print these?" She printed everything. He drove home with a folder of documents on the passenger seat and went directly to the workshop where he sat at Clifford's workbench and read through everything again, slowly cross-referencing it against the contract he had found 3 days earlier at the bottom of a wooden box tucked under the main workbench beneath a folded canvas and a set of old calibration tools. He had found the contract on a Tuesday afternoon working alone while Owen was at school. It was in a manila envelope with no label, sealed with dried tape that had long since lost its adhesion and fallen loose. Inside was a 6-page document typed on letterhead he recognized from the patent filings. Aldrich Energy Solutions, Lexington, Kentucky, dated March 14, 1974. The language was formal and dense, the kind of legal prose designed to be technically precise while remaining practically impenetrable to anyone without legal training. Grayson had read it with a dictionary open on his phone, looking up terms as he went writing his own plain language summary in the margin of his legal pad. The sale of Merit Innovation Group to Aldrich Energy Solutions. $2 million paid in full at closing. All patent rights transferred. Clifford's agreement to a 5-year non-compete on the specific technology. And then on page 5 in a section labeled Conditions and Reversionary Interests, a clause that Grayson had read 4 times before he trusted his own understanding of it. In the event that Aldrich Energy Solutions or any successor entity fails to commercially develop and bring to market one or more products incorporating the transferred technology within a period of 25 years, from the date of this agreement, all rights to the transferred patents shall automatically revert to Clifford James Merritt or his lawful heirs. Grayson had sat very still after reading that. 25 years from March 1974 was March 1999. He now sat in the workshop with the contract and the library printouts spread across Clifford's workbench side by side, and the picture they made together was very clear. Aldrich Holdings had known about the reversion clause. They had let the 25 years expire without developing anything deliberately because developing the technology would have undercut their interests in traditional energy infrastructure. And then in 1999, when the patents had legally reverted to Clifford by the terms of their own contract, they had simply continued licensing them as if nothing had changed, as if the reversion clause did not exist, as if Clifford Merritt were not alive and capable of asserting his rights. For 25 years after the reversion, they had sold what they did not own. Grayson picked up the phone and called the number the probate attorney had given him at the end of their initial conversation, the name of an intellectual property attorney in Lexington, who Farwell had mentioned in passing as someone who handled inventor disputes. Theodore Weston. He'd been holding the number for 2 weeks, waiting until he had something worth bringing. He had something now. The next morning, before he drove to Lexington, the county showed up. He heard the vehicles before he saw them. 2 cruisers and a sedan coming up the gravel road in the early morning, moving with the deliberate pace of official business. The county sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Fitch, whom Grayson had met briefly at the tax office, climbed out of the lead cruiser with a document in his hand and the expression of someone delivering a message they hadn't written. "Morning, Grayson," Fitch said. "I'm sorry about this. Got an order here for a property inspection. Anonymous complaint was filed regarding unsafe living conditions for a minor child. State code requires us to follow up." "Anonymous," Grayson said. "That's what it says." The building inspector came out of the sedan, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who moved through the house with a clipboard and a camera documenting every visible deficiency with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his job was to find problems, not to weigh them. The collapsed ceiling in Owen's room, the outdated wiring in the kitchen, the inadequate heating system, the structural questions about the front porch. The inspector photographed everything and wrote in his clipboard and said very little. When it was over, Fitch handed Grayson a copy of the inspection report and said, "You've got 45 days to bring the structure up to code. If it doesn't pass re-inspection, I'm required to notify Child Protective Services of a hazardous living environment." Grayson looked at the report. Then he looked at Fitch. "Who filed the complaint, Dale?" "It's anonymous," Fitch said again, and the way he said it carefully without meeting Grayson's eyes was itself a kind of answer. After they left, Grayson sat on the front steps in the November cold and looked at the inspection report. The repairs required would cost at minimum more money than he had. He was already running on the last of the 401k withdrawal after the tax payment and the moving costs. He had perhaps 3 weeks of living expenses remaining before he would need to find work locally. He thought about what Eugenia had said. Someone convinced him that being smart made him safe. He took out his phone and looked up the Harlan County Sheriff's campaign finance disclosures, which were public record. It took him 11 minutes to find what he was looking for. Warren Aldrich's name appeared in the donor list for Dale Fitch's last 2 election campaigns. The contributions were not enormous, just large enough to matter in a county election, just small enough to be deniable as anything but civic support. Grayson wrote it down. He wrote down everything now. He had started keeping a log 3 days after Randolph Aldrich's phone call, a running record of dates, names, offers, interactions, and observations written in a spare composition notebook that he kept in the inside pocket of his work jacket. Every conversation with Sterling Vance. Every visit from anyone connected to the Aldrich family. The exact wording of Randolph's call. The date and time the inspection warrant arrived. He drove to Lexington that afternoon. Theodore Weston's office was on the 4th floor of a building that had probably been impressive in 1985 and had since settled into a comfortable competence. Good furniture, a lot of files, the smell of serious work. Weston himself was 51, with the compact, unhurried manner of a man who had learned that clarity was more valuable than speed. He shook Grayson's hand and gestured to the chair across from his desk and said, "Tell me what you have." Grayson told him, and then he laid it out. The original patents photocopied from the library printouts, the 1974 contract with the reversion clause, his own plain language summary of what the clause meant and when it had triggered, the USPTO licensing records showing 25 years of income from patents that had legally reverted in 1999, the proof of concept device photographs he'd taken with his phone, the inspection report, the campaign finance records showing Warren Aldrich's donations to the county sheriff. He laid it all out in a row on Theodore Weston's desk and sat back. Weston looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. He picked up the 1974 contract and read the reversion clause. Then he set it down and looked at the USPTO printouts. Then he looked at Grayson. "You put this together yourself," Weston said. "With help from a librarian," Grayson said. "The reversion clause interpretation is correct," Weston said. "The 25-year period expired in March 1999. If Aldrich Holdings failed to commercialize, and based on what you've shown me, they clearly did, then the patents reverted to your grandfather by the terms of their own contract. Everything they've earned from licensing since 1999 was earned from property they did not legally own." "So it's theft," Grayson said. "It's a category of theft that has a very complicated legal name," Weston said. "But yes, in plain terms, yes." "What can we do about it?" Weston was quiet for a moment. "We can file in federal district court. Patent claims fall under federal jurisdiction. We'd be asking for the return of the patent rights and restitution of all licensing income earned after the reversion date." He paused. "I want to be honest with you about what that means. Aldrich Holdings will respond with their full legal apparatus. These cases take time. They take resources. And they have a history of using procedural delays to exhaust opponents who don't have the financial endurance to outlast them. How long, Grayson asked. Could be 18 months to get to a trial date. Could be longer. And the custody situation, if I lose the house before then, Weston looked at the inspection report. That's the leverage point. They're trying to remove you from the property and disrupt your ability to pursue the claim. If CPS gets involved and Owen is removed from your custody, it creates complications in the patent case as well. It becomes harder to maintain standing as the heir in possession of the property. He set the report down. You need to fix the house. I know, Grayson said. You need to fix it within 45 days. I know that too. He drove home through the early dark, the Lexington streetlights giving way to County Road, and then to the gravel track, and the farmhouse sitting in its November stillness, the workshop lights still burning because he'd left it on when he went out that morning. He sat in the truck in the driveway for a moment before going in. Inside, Owen was at the kitchen table with his homework and a bowl of cereal that he'd made himself because it was 7 o'clock and he was 9 years old, and he'd learned not to wait past 7. He looked up when Grayson came in and read something in his father's face with the quiet accuracy that children develop when they have lived close to an adult who is carrying something. Bad day, Owen asked. Medium day, Grayson said. We have some things to figure out. He sat down and explained it, not all of it, not the full financial complexity, but the shape of it. The inspection, the repairs, the timeline. The fact that someone had arranged for the inspection to happen and why. Owen listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him that was not 9 years old at all. When Grayson was done, Owen said, So we have to fix the house. Yes. Can we do that? Grayson thought about the inspection report, the collapsed ceiling, the wiring, the porch, the heating. He thought about his hands, which had been building and repairing things since he was a teenager, working construction summers with an uncle who had never given compliments but had kept hiring him back. He thought about the workshop tools on their pegboard, each one in its traced outline, each one sharp and ready. I think we can do most of it ourselves, he said. Owen nodded, then he said, Dad, there's something you need to see. He pushed his homework aside and retrieved a small wooden box from the shelf where they had been storing Clifford's documents as they cataloged them. He set the box on the table and lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a folded square of flannel, was an envelope. Grayson looked at it. The envelope was old, the paper slightly yellowed, but sealed, the flap tucked under rather than glued the way people sealed personal letters when they expected them to be opened and read. In the upper left corner in handwriting, he now recognized as well as his own, C. Merritt, Harlan County, Kentucky. Addressed to Elaine Aldrich Merritt at an address in Lexington that Grayson recognized as her parents' house, the address she'd had before she and Grayson were married. Dated November 2001. The postmark had never been stamped. The letter had never been mailed. Where was this? Grayson asked. Behind the box with the first journals, Owen said. I found it this afternoon. It was stuck to the back of the bottom with an old piece of tape. I didn't open it. Grayson looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he opened it. The letter was 2 pages written in Clifford's hand. He read it at the kitchen table with Owen sitting quietly across from him. Clifford had written it in November 2001, 2 years after the reversion clause had triggered. He had discovered by then, he wrote, that Aldrich Holdings had continued licensing the patents as if the reversion had never occurred. He had contacted an attorney who had told him that pursuing the claim against Aldrich Holdings would require resources he did not have and could take years. He had made the decision to wait, to preserve the evidence, to document everything, to leave it for someone who would come after him. He had written the letter to Elaine because Elaine was the only member of the Aldrich family he believed might understand what had been done to him. He had never sent it because he was afraid not of Randolph, but of what sending it might cost Elaine and her own family. He had kept it because he could not bring himself to destroy it. He had eventually decided that wherever it ended up, it would end up where it was meant to. The final paragraph read, Elaine, I am not angry at your grandfather for what he did. Anger is for people who are surprised. I was not surprised. I am only angry that I trusted someone with something I had spent my life building, and that trust was used against me. I am leaving everything I have in the workshop and in the walls of this house. Someday someone will come who is ready to use it. I believe that person will come from our family. I believe that because I have to believe it. Grayson set the letter down on the table. Owen was watching him. Did Mom know? He asked. I don't know, Grayson said. The letter was never sent. She may never have known it existed. He paused. But your grandfather kept it. He didn't throw it away. I think he wanted it to be found. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he trusted us. Yes, Grayson said. He did. That night after Owen was asleep, Grayson went to the workshop and sat at Clifford's workbench with the letter and the contract and the USPTO printouts all together under the work light. He thought about trust, the specific, costly, irreversible kind of trust that Clifford had extended twice. Once to Randolph Aldrich, which had been taken and used against him, and once to whoever would come after him, whoever would find the hidden panels and the locked workshop and the journals that assumed the reader would keep reading. The second trust had landed exactly where it was meant to. He thought about the repairs ahead. The ceiling first, he could handle that himself, had patched plaster before. The wiring would need a licensed electrician for the panel upgrade, but Eugenia had mentioned a man down the road who did electrical work at honest prices and wouldn't ask too many questions. The porch support posts were straightforward carpentry. The heating system was the problem. It was old enough to be dangerous and would need replacement, not repair, and that was the expensive part. He opened his notebook and began making a list. Materials, labor, sequence. What he could do himself and what he couldn't. What could wait and what absolutely could not. By the time he closed the notebook, it was past midnight. He was tired in the way that comes from using your mind hard for a long time. A different tiredness than the physical exhaustion of the diner, but no less real. He turned off the work light and sat for a moment in the dark, the November silence of the property settling around him. He had been here 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, he had gone from a man who owned nothing but a rusted truck and a folder of medical bills to a man who might, if he could hold the house together and the legal case together, simultaneously be sitting on a patent claim worth more than he could fully imagine. The distance between those two positions felt both enormous and impossibly fragile, like a bridge made of materials he didn't fully trust. But Clifford had trusted him, had specifically, explicitly, patiently trusted him across decades and distance in a silence that had lasted until it didn't. He owed the man a fight. He went back to the house, checked that Owen was covered, and lay down on his own mattress in the dark. Outside, the wind was picking up, coming off the ridge, with a particular edge that meant real cold was moving in. He was nearly asleep when he heard it. Tires on the gravel moving slowly, no headlights visible through the window. A vehicle stopping at the end of the drive and sitting there for perhaps 2 minutes, then quietly moving on. He lay still and listened to the night and did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, he called Theodore Weston and told him to begin preparing the federal filing. Then he put on his work boots and went to the workshop to get the tools he needed for the ceiling repair, because you could not fight on 2 fronts simultaneously without keeping both fronts moving, and the house was not going to fix itself. And 45 days was 45 days, regardless of what Randolph Aldrich did or didn't do in the dark at the end of a gravel driveway. He had Clifford's tools in his hands and Clifford's truth on his side. That would have to be enough. For now, it would have to be enough. The ceiling came down first, which was the right order. You could not fix what was beneath a problem until you had addressed the problem itself, and the collapsed plaster in Owen's room was the most visible failure in a house full of visible failures. Grayson pulled the rest of the damaged section down himself on a Saturday morning, working with a pry bar and a dust mask, Owen standing in the doorway watching with the focused attention he brought to anything that involved his father working with tools. The lath beneath was partially rotted from water infiltration, but the joists above were sound old-growth timber, dense and dry at the core, despite decades of exposure, the kind of wood they simply did not mill anymore. Grayson spent 2 days cleaning the cavity, treating the wood, replacing the damaged lath strips with boards he cut from lumber he'd found stacked in the back of the workshop, seasoned so long it had turned the color of dark honey. He mixed the plaster in small batches and applied it in 3 coats the way Clifford's workshop manuals described. He'd found a section in one of the non-technical journals where Clifford had written out basic repair procedures for the house, as if he'd anticipated that whoever came after him would need to know these things and might not have had anyone to teach them. Grayson read those pages more than once. There was something in them that felt like a conversation, the kind of quiet instruction a father gives a son over a workbench on a winter afternoon, unhurried, assuming the student has the patience to learn what is being taught. He began to understand reading between the repair notes and the technical journals that Clifford had spent his later years doing 2 things simultaneously, advancing his scientific work and quietly preparing this place for whoever would inherit it. Every repair procedure written down, every tool labeled and sharpened, every document organized and sealed against time. He had not given up. He had gotten ready. He worked on the house every day. The wiring required an electrician for the panel upgrade, which county code mandated, and Eugenia delivered on her promise of someone honest. A man named Roy Ballard, who had been doing electrical work in Harlan County for 30 years, whose rates were fair and whose questions were minimal, and who looked at the old knob and tube in the walls with the respectful wariness of a man who understood exactly what he was dealing with. Roy worked 3 days and charged what he said he would charge, which was something Grayson had learned not to take for granted. The porch support posts were straightforward. Grayson cut and set them himself, plumbing each one carefully, toenailing them to the sill plate with the kind of attention to square and level that Clifford's tools demanded. The old workshop had a level that was still accurate. He checked it against a digital one he borrowed from Roy, and a framing square that had been kept sharp and true. Using Clifford's tools felt like something more than practical convenience. It felt like a conversation conducted in the language of wood and metal and measured angles, the same language Clifford had spoken for 60 years in the same county on the same land. The heating system was the hard part, as he'd known it would be. The old furnace was beyond repair, a cast iron relic that had been limping along on borrowed time for longer than Owen had been alive. A new system would cost money he did not have in the way that the other repairs had cost money he did not have. This was a different order of magnitude. He spent 2 evenings running numbers, and then he spent a third evening in the workshop looking at Clifford's design notes for the larger scaled system described in the later journals. He did not build the full system. He was not ready for that, not yet. But he understood enough by now to know that the workshop's existing electrical infrastructure, Clifford had wired it carefully. Running dedicated circuits from a separate small panel could support an expanded version of the proof of concept that would handle the workshop and the main living areas of the house. He spent a week building it, following Clifford's notes methodically, making the decisions that the notes left to the builder's judgment, learning the system from the inside out, the way you can only learn something by constructing it with your own hands from its most basic components. When he switched it on for the first time at full capacity, it ran cleanly from the first hour. No fluctuation, no heat, no noise beyond the steady, functional hum he had come to think of as Clifford's voice. He used the power it generated to run electric resistance heaters in the main living areas. Not elegant, not permanent, but functional and safe, and crucially free. The inspector's code requirement was for adequate heat, not for a specific type of heating system. Grayson documented everything: the system's output, the wiring configuration, the safety measures, and photographed it all carefully in case the inspector had opinions. On the 38th day, with 7 days to spare, he called the county and requested reinspection. The inspector, the same thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, arrived on a Thursday morning and moved through the house with his clipboard for 90 minutes. He documented the repaired ceiling, smooth and dry and properly painted, the new wiring, the rebuilt porch supports, plumb and solid, the heating solution, which he examined for longer than the other items, consulting his codebook twice before writing something in his notes with the deliberate care of someone making a decision they want on record correctly. He handed Grayson the reinspection report at the door. Grayson read it standing on the porch in the November cold. The property had passed, all noted deficiencies corrected or satisfactorily addressed. No further action required at this time. He folded the report and put it in his jacket pocket next to the composition notebook where he kept his log. Theodore Weston called that same afternoon. He had filed the federal complaint 2 weeks earlier, and Aldrich Holdings had responded exactly as Weston had predicted, with a legal team of 8 attorneys from a Washington, D.C. firm that specialized in intellectual property defense for corporate clients. Their initial response had been a motion to dismiss on the grounds that the reversion clause was ambiguous and that Grayson lacked standing as an heir to assert the original contracting party's rights. Weston had filed the opposition. The motion to dismiss had been denied. A trial date had been set for 6 weeks out before Judge Patricia Holt in the Eastern District of Kentucky. "They'll ask for a continuance," Weston said. "Probably more than one. It's standard practice delay. The proceedings hope the opposing party runs out of money or patience." "Let them ask," Grayson said. "Judge Holt has a reputation for limited patience with procedural delay in straightforward cases," Weston said. "She may deny the first continuance entirely." "Good," Grayson said. 3 days later, the family court filing arrived. Warren and Sylvia Aldrich had petitioned for emergency guardianship of Owen Merritt, citing the county inspection report, the original one, from the anonymous complaint as evidence of an unsafe living environment. They had filed before the reinspection, Grayson realized. They had filed when they believed he would fail the reinspection, when they had been certain the financial pressure of the repairs would be the thing that broke him. Grayson called Weston and explained the situation. "File the reinspection report with the family court immediately," Weston said. "Their petition is predicated on the original inspection findings. Once the court sees the property has passed reinspection, the foundation of the petition collapses. They can argue other grounds, but they've lost their strongest one." "Will they try other grounds?" "Warren Aldrich will try whatever he has," Weston said. "But without the housing issue, he's arguing that a father with a steady home and no criminal record and a child who is healthy and attending school is somehow unfit. That's a much harder case to make." Grayson filed the reinspection report with the family court the following morning. He also filed, with Weston's guidance, a counter-motion documenting the timing of the anonymous complaint relative to the patent dispute in the campaign finance connection between Warren Aldrich and the county sheriff. Not as a formal accusation, not yet, but as context for the court's consideration of the petition's origins. 2 days after that, Randolph Aldrich appeared at the farmhouse for the second time. He came alone. No lawyers, no Sterling Vance, no Warren and Sylvia flanking him for support. Just Randolph in a dark coat driving himself in a car that was expensive enough to be quiet, stepping out onto the gravel with the deliberate movements of a very old man who would not under any circumstances permit himself to seem old. Grayson met him on the porch. They looked at each other for a moment. The November air was thin and cold between them. "You've been busy," Randolph said. He was looking at the porch supports, the new post plumb and straight, the fresh-cut wood still pale against the weathered boards. "Lot to do," Grayson said. Randolph's pale eyes moved over the front of the house, taking inventory with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent his career evaluating properties and understanding what they were worth. Then they came back to Grayson with the specific quality of attention that a man deploys when he is reassessing something he had previously underestimated. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," Randolph said. It was not offered as a compliment. "I had good notes," Grayson said. A pause. The wind moved through the ridge trees above them, carrying the smell of coming snow. "This doesn't have to continue the way it's going," Randolph said. "You're about to spend the next 2 years in federal litigation against attorneys who have never lost a patent case. You have a child who needs stability, not a courtroom education. I'm prepared to offer you $500,000. Clear title to the house, all litigation drop both sides, including the custody matter. You walk away with enough money to give that boy a real future." Grayson looked at him for a long moment. $500,000. He was aware of what it was. He was aware of what it wasn't. "Clifford trusted you," Grayson said. "He believed you would do what you said you'd do. He believed you cared about what he'd built." Randolph's expression did not change. Elaine trusted your family, Grayson said. She married into it. She brought Owen into it. Still nothing from Randolph, the pale eyes steady and without apology. I don't, Grayson said. I don't trust you, and I'm not going to make the same mistake Clifford made. We're going to court. Randolph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You'll regret this. Maybe, Grayson said, but it'll be my regret. He went inside and closed the door. He stood in the front room and listened to the sound of Randolph's car on the gravel diminishing gone. Then he went to the kitchen and put water on for coffee and sat down at the table with his notebook and wrote down the date and time and the exact words of the offer and his response. Because he wrote everything down now, because Clifford had written everything down, and that habit had saved everything. Owen came home from school an hour later and dropped his backpack by the door and said, I smell coffee. Are you okay? I'm fine, Grayson said. We had a visitor. Owen sat down across from him and waited. He offered us $500,000 to go away, Grayson said. Owen considered this with the gravity it deserved. Is that a lot? It's a lot, Grayson said. It's not what Clifford's work is worth. It's not what they owe us. And it's not what Clifford would have wanted. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad, Great-Grandpa waited 40 years. We can wait a little longer. Grayson looked at his son across the kitchen table in the house his grandfather had built in the kitchen that smelled like coffee and plaster dust, and the particular cold of a Kentucky November coming through the gaps he hadn't sealed yet, and he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. Yeah, he said, we can. The trial date held. Judge Patricia Holt denied Aldrich Holdings' first continuance request on the grounds that the legal issues presented were not of unusual complexity and that the evidence base had been extensively documented prior to filing. She denied the second request filed 2 weeks later in a written order of 4 sentences, the last of which read, Further delay requests in this matter will require demonstration of extraordinary cause. No third request was filed. On the morning of the trial, Grayson drove to Lexington in the dark. Owen in the passenger seat, the folder of documents on the back seat in the order Theodore Weston had organized them. Owen wore his good shirt, which he had ironed himself with the iron they'd found in the farmhouse kitchen, taking care with the collar and the cuffs, the way someone takes care when the occasion is important enough to get right. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked out the window at the pre-dawn hills going past the ridgelines barely visible against the dark sky. You nervous? Owen asked. Extremely, Grayson said. Me too, Owen said. But I think that's okay. The courtroom was fuller than Grayson had expected. Business reporters had gotten wind of the case through the federal filing records, a patent dispute with a reversion clause, an individual plaintiff against a major regional holding company, numbers in the 9 figures. There were people in the gallery he didn't recognize, and the Aldrich side of the room was a landscape of dark suits and confident posture. Randolph Aldrich sat at the defendant's table beside Margaret Voss, the lead attorney from the Washington firm, a woman in her 60s with the focused, dangerous composure of someone who had spent a career winning cases that appeared to favor her opponents. Warren and Sylvia were in the gallery behind Randolph. They looked at Grayson when he came in. He looked back at them briefly and then looked away. Owen was directed to a seat in the front row of the gallery, close enough to the bar that Grayson could see him when he turned. The boy sat with his hands folded on his knees and his back straight, watching everything with the quiet attention he brought to anything he had decided was worth understanding fully. Judge Patricia Holt entered the courtroom at 9 o'clock exactly, and the room came to order with the particular efficiency of a court that understood its own time was not unlimited. Holt was in her early 60s, precise and undecorated, with the manner of someone who had heard every version of every argument and was interested only in the version supported by evidence. She looked at both tables and said, We're here on a patent rights dispute with a reversion clause at its center. I've read the briefs from both parties. I'm going to ask both counsel to be direct and to assume I'm capable of understanding the relevant facts without embellishment. We'll begin with plaintiff's opening. Weston stood and walked to the center of the courtroom and told the story the way Grayson had told it to him, plainly in sequence without decoration. The patents, the contract, the clause, the expiration date, the 25 years of licensing that had followed. He held up the 1974 contract and read the reversion language directly into the record. He held up the USPTO licensing records. He named the number $127 million and let it sit in the air without commentary. Then he said, "The plaintiff will demonstrate that Aldrich Holdings has known since at least 1999 that the patents had legally reverted. We will show that the defendant continued licensing these patents regardless, and that this represents not a contractual misunderstanding, but a deliberate and sustained decision to profit from property they did not legally own." Margaret Voss's opening was longer and built around a single argument. The reversion clause, she said, was ambiguous. The term commercially develop was not defined in the contract, and Aldrich Holdings' extensive research and assessment activities over the 25-year period constituted development within any reasonable interpretation of that term. She spoke without notes and with great fluency, and the argument she made was technically coherent, and Grayson watched her and understood why companies like Aldrich Holdings paid attorneys like this one what they paid them. When Voss sat down, Weston called his first witness. He called Grayson. Grayson walked to the stand and took the oath and sat down, and Weston stood across from him with the patient, deliberate manner of a man who trusted his witness and did not intend to rush. "Mr. Merritt," Weston began, "can you describe the condition of the property when you first arrived?" Grayson described it: the sagging roof, the collapsed ceiling, the boards over the windows, the barn with its wall folded in. He described it plainly without self-pity, the way you describe damage when you are already thinking about the repair. "And what did you find when you entered the workshop?" Grayson described the tools on their pegboards, each one in its traced outline: the workbench, the journals, the canvas tarp over the proof-of-concept device. He described the hidden panel in Owen's room and the bundles of documents, and the night he and Owen had spread them across the floor by lamplight and read the first line of the first journal. "What did you find in the 1974 contract?" Weston asked. Grayson explained the reversion clause in the language he had developed over weeks of reading and rereading it, clear and precise, without legal ornamentation. He explained what 25 years meant. He explained 1999. "And did you have any legal training that helped you identify the significance of this clause?" "No," Grayson said. "How did you come to understand its meaning?" "I read it with a dictionary," Grayson said. "More than once. And then I went to the public library and asked a librarian to help me search the USPTO records to see what had happened to the patents after 1999. There was a quiet in the courtroom that was not exactly silence, more the quality of a room full of people deciding to pay closer attention." "And what did those records show?" Weston asked. Grayson walked through the licensing records the way he had learned them at the library table with Marge Dunfield beside him. The agreements, the companies, the dates, the dollar amounts, cross-referenced from the SEC filings. He was not reading from notes. He had spent months living inside these numbers, and they were part of him now. When Voss stood to cross-examine, she focused on his technical qualifications. Did he have an engineering degree, number and a background in energy systems, number intellectual property law, num? She established efficiently and professionally that he was a former restaurant worker and a handyman who had found some old papers and drawn large conclusions. Grayson waited until she finished. Then he said calmly, to no one in particular, "I understand my grandfather's handwriting." That was enough. Voss did not respond to this. She sat down. Weston called an expert witness, a patent attorney from Louisville, who walked the court through the technical reading of the reversion clause and testified that by any standard interpretation, Aldrich Holdings' failure to bring a product to market constituted a clear failure to commercially develop the technology within the meaning of the contract. He called a second expert, an energy industry analyst, who testified that the patents remained commercially viable and had in fact increased in value as interest in distributed energy generation had grown over the past decade, and that the licensing fees Aldrich Holdings had charged were consistent with market rates for technology of this significance. Then Weston called Randolph Aldrich. Randolph walked to the stand with the measured pace of a man who had decided to treat the witness box as simply another seat in a room he owned. He settled himself and looked at Weston with the pale, steady attention he gave to everything. Weston stood at the center of the courtroom and said quietly, "Mr. Aldrich, in the 25 years between 1974 and 1999, did Aldrich Energy Solutions or any successor entity manufacture a single product incorporating the merit patents?" A pause. "We conducted extensive research and assessment. Yes or no, Mr. Aldrich?" The pause this time was different, heavier. "No," Randolph said. "In those 25 years, did you hire engineers specifically tasked with developing the merit technology for commercial production? We had internal teams that reviewed yes or no." "No." "Did you establish manufacturing facilities for the purpose of producing any device based on the merit patents?" "No." "Did you enter into any partnership, joint venture, or production agreement aimed at bringing a merit patent-based product to market?" "No." "Did you at any point after March 1999 inform Clifford Merritt or his representatives that you considered the reversion clause to have been triggered and that the patents had reverted to him?" The silence that followed this question lasted long enough that Judge Holt looked up from her notes. "No," Randolph Aldrich said. The word fell into the courtroom the way a stone falls into still water, not loud but with a weight that sent its effect outward in all directions simultaneously. Grayson, sitting beside Weston at the plaintiff's table, did not move. He had been waiting for that silence without knowing he was waiting for it. 5 decades of a particular kind of fraud distilled into one syllable spoken by the man who had carried it. Voss conducted a redirect examination that lasted 40 minutes and was professionally executed and ultimately could not undo what the 5 questions had done. You cannot unsay no 5 times on a federal witness stand in front of a court reporter and a sitting judge and a gallery that includes business reporters with open notebooks. Judge Holt recessed for the afternoon and said she would deliver her ruling at 9 o'clock the following morning. Grayson took Owen to a diner near the courthouse for dinner. They sat in a booth by the window and ordered the kind of food you order when you are too tired to think about food eggs. Toast coffee for Grayson and orange juice for Owen, and they ate without talking much, watching the Lexington evening traffic move past the window. "He said no 5 times, Owen said at one point. "Yes," Grayson said. "He knew the whole time," Owen said. "Yes," Grayson said. "He knew." Owen drank his orange juice and looked out the window. "Do you think Great-Grandpa knew it would end up in a courtroom?" Grayson thought about the journals, the careful preservation of every document, the reversion clause preserved in the contract preserved in the envelope preserved beneath the canvas at the bottom of the box, the letter to Elaine never sent but never destroyed, the letter to whoever finds this written in 2019, 3 years before Clifford died, with the specific patience of a man making his final arrangements and trusting them to hold. "I think he knew it might," Grayson said. "I think he set up everything so that if it did, we'd have what we needed." They drove back to Harlan that night. Grayson tucked Owen in and then sat alone in the kitchen for a while, the house quiet around him. He thought about Clifford at the workshop bench in the years after 1974, after Randolph Aldrich's promises had revealed their true shape, what it had taken to keep working, to keep writing in journals that might never be read, to keep believing that the truth preserved carefully enough would eventually find its moment. He had not given up. He had simply chosen a longer timeline than most men would accept, and he had trusted that the work itself was the argument and that the argument would hold. He went to bed at midnight and slept, which surprised him. In the morning, the drive back to Lexington. Owen in the front seat, same good shirt. The hills coming out of the early dark into a gray November morning, low clouds moving fast off the ridges, the temperature dropping towards something that felt like a reckoning. The courtroom filled quickly. The gallery was fuller than the day before. Randolph sat at the defendant's table with Voss and the 6 other attorneys arranged behind him. And Grayson thought that whatever happened in the next hour, the 5 questions and the 5 answers were already in the federal record and would remain there regardless of what any of them did next. Judge Holt entered at 9 o'clock. She did not take long. Grayson would remember later that it had felt much longer than it was, the way important moments compressed time in one direction and stretch it in another so that you experience both the briefness of the thing and its enormous weight simultaneously. But her ruling when she delivered it was clear and without hesitation the work of a judge who had made her decision well before she walked through the door. She found the reversion clause unambiguous. She found that Aldrich Holdings' conduct over the 25-year period extensively documented, admitted on the stand, did not constitute commercial development within the meaning of the contract by any reasonable standard. She found that the patents had legally reverted to Clifford James Merritt in March 1999, and that Aldrich Holdings' licensing activities after that date had constituted willful and sustained patent infringement. She awarded the patents in full to Grayson and Owen Merritt as Clifford's lawful heirs. She ordered Aldrich Holdings to pay restitution of $127 million, representing the full amount of licensing revenue earned after the reversion date. She denied the request for a stay pending appeal, citing the duration of the infringement, and the defendants demonstrated awareness of the reversion clause. And then she looked up from her papers and said to the courtroom in general, "This case is a straightforward one, made complicated by the resources available to one party and not the other. The law on this question is not ambiguous. What was taken must be returned. Court is adjourned." The gavel. Grayson sat still at the plaintiff's table for a moment after the sound of it, Weston's hand on his shoulder, the noise of the gallery rising. Somewhere behind him, the movement and the voices and the reporters standing. He turned and looked for Owen. Owen was sitting exactly where he had been in the front row of the gallery, hands still folded on his knees, watching his father. His expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter than that, the expression of a child who has understood that what just happened was not the end of a story, but the condition under which a different story could now begin. Grayson went to him, sat down beside him, said nothing for a moment. Owen said, "Great-grandpa would have liked her." Judge Holt. "Yeah," Grayson said. "I think he would." They were in the hallway outside the courtroom when Weston found them and pulled Grayson aside. His expression was different from anything Grayson had seen on him before, controlled, but barely a man holding professional composure over something that wanted very much to show. "There's something else," Weston said. "I didn't tell you in advance because I wasn't certain it would matter to the case, and I wanted the case to stand on what it was. But 2 weeks ago, I sent a complete packet of the licensing records, the post-1999 agreements, the amounts, the corporate filings that listed the Merritt patents as Aldrich Holdings assets to the SEC. Grayson looked at him. "Aldrich Holdings has been listing these patents in their SEC filings as company-owned intellectual property for 24 years, Weston said. "They use them to establish asset valuations, to back credit lines, to attract investment. If the patents were not legally theirs after 1999, and the court has now confirmed they were not, then every SEC filing that included them as assets was materially false." The implications settled over Grayson the way large things settle, not all at once, but in stages, each one heavier than the last. "Securities fraud," Grayson said. "Federal." Weston confirmed. "The SEC opened a formal inquiry this morning. I received notification during the lunch recess. Randolph Aldrich's attorneys have already been contacted." Grayson thought about the 5 questions and the 5 answers. He thought about how Randolph had looked on the stand, controlled, still the pale eyes giving nothing. And he thought about how that same control would hold and then not hold when the weight of a federal criminal investigation was added to what had just been placed on top of it in that courtroom. "Warren and Sylvia," he asked. "The family court petition," Weston said, "has been formally withdrawn. I received the notice 40 minutes ago." Grayson was quiet for a moment. He looked down the hallway at Owen, who had drifted to the window and was looking out at the Lexington street below the cars in the gray November light, in the ordinary continuation of a city that did not know what had just happened inside the building behind him. Grayson walked over and stood beside him. "Weston sent something to the SEC," Grayson said, "before the trial. The filings they made claiming to own what wasn't theirs. It's a criminal matter now." Owen turned from the window. "For Mr. Aldrich?" "Yes." Owen thought about this with the seriousness it warranted. Then he said, Great-grandpa didn't get to see this part. No, Grayson said. He didn't. But he set it up so we could. Yes, Grayson said. That's exactly what he did. They drove back to Harlan in the early afternoon through the hills that had been bare and cold when they drove out that morning, and that looked coming home different in a way that had nothing to do with the light or the weather. The road narrowed from highway to county road to the gravel track through the ridge trees, and the farmhouse appeared at the end of the drive, the way it always appeared now, with its repaired porch and its new support posts, and its windows uncovered the afternoon light coming through glass that he and Owen had cleaned together on a Saturday 3 weeks earlier, working with vinegar and old newspaper the way Eugenia had suggested. Eugenia was waiting for them. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at Grayson the way someone looks when they have been right about a person for a long time and are quietly satisfied to have been right. She was holding a casserole dish in both hands, steam visible at the foil edges. I figured you wouldn't remember to eat, she said. You were right, Grayson said. I usually am, she said. Clifford could have used someone to tell him that more often. They ate in the kitchen with the wood stove running and the November dark coming on early outside the windows. Eugenia told stories about Clifford that Grayson had not heard the time he'd rewired a neighbor's entire barn in one weekend after a lightning strike, refusing payment, accepting only the man's word that he'd pass the favor along someday. The time he'd driven to Lexington to attend a university lecture on electromagnetic theory and had cornered the professor afterward to point out 3 errors in the derivations on the board politely, but without any particular apology because the math was wrong, and wrong math in a public lecture was a disservice to the students. He was always like that, Eugenia said. He believed that if you knew something true, you had an obligation to say so. Didn't matter who disagreed with you. Owen listened to all of it with his chin in his hand, filing it away in whatever place he filed the things that mattered. After Eugenia left, the kitchen was quiet in the particular way of a room where something important has recently been said, and the air still holds the shape of it. Grayson washed the dishes by hand, the warm water running over his knuckles, looking out the window above the sink at the workshop, where the single bulb behind the small window threw a pale rectangle onto the frozen ground. He went out to the workshop alone. He turned on the work light and stood at Clifford's bench and looked at the expanded system he'd built over the past weeks. The proof of concept at its center, the additional collection arrays added according to the later journals, the conditioning circuits and the storage bank running in quiet parallel. He had been operating it long enough to know its patterns, its rhythms, the way it responded to different atmospheric conditions. It was consistent and reliable, and once you understood what it was actually doing, beautifully simple, catching what the sky was giving away and putting it to use. He opened the 16th journal to the final entry. The entry was dated October 2021, 14 months before Clifford died, and the handwriting was slightly looser than in the earlier journals. The hand of a man in his early 80s, working by lamplight in a room he had worked in for 6 decades. But the precision was still present in the way the letters were formed, the intention still fully legible. He read it standing at the bench in the light of the same overhead bulb that had burned through his first night here. Clifford had written, "I have done everything I can do. The rest is not mine to do. I have left the tools, I have left the notes, I have left the machine running as proof of the principle. I have left the contract where someone patient will find it. I have left the letter where someone careful will keep it. I have done what a man can do who is at the end of his working life and has not finished his work. The work will be finished, not by me, by whoever comes next." I believe this with the only kind of certainty that matters, which is not based on evidence, but on something older and less arguable than evidence. The machine works. It always worked. I was just waiting for the right hands. Grayson set the journal down on the bench. He stood in the workshop in the light of the single overhead bulb in the quiet hum of the machine his grandfather had built and left running on patience and faith. And he understood not for the first time, but more completely than he had been able to before what it was that Clifford had actually given him. Not patents, not $127 million, which was real and would change things and would matter enormously in the practical terms of a life and a child's future. Not even the machine itself, which was remarkable and real and would go out into the world and reduce the power bills of families who needed that reduction the most. What Clifford had given him was a demonstration that some things are worth preserving, even when the person doing the preserving will not be there to see what the preservation makes possible. That patience is a form of courage. That trust extended forward through time, through decades of silence, through a sealed workshop, in a hidden panel, and a letter never mailed, is not naivety, but its opposite. A clear-eyed faith that the truth carefully kept will eventually find the hands that can use it. Grayson had been losing things for 3 years. A wife, a home, a version of the future that had seemed before the cancer like something he could count on. He had been learning in the particular grinding school of loss that some things cannot be recovered and must instead be transformed into something new that does not require the original to be present. He had not finished learning this. He suspected he would not finish for a long time, but he was standing in the right place to keep learning it, and he had a son who was learning it alongside him, and that was more than enough. He turned off the work light. He walked out of the workshop into the Kentucky night. The cold was serious now, genuine winter cold coming off the ridges with intent, the kind of cold that means what it says. The sky above was clear and dense with stars, the kind of sky that exists only far from city light, infinite and steady, and somehow clarifying as though the darkness itself had decided to be useful. Owen's light was on in his room, the room with the repaired ceiling, the new plaster smooth and dry, the hidden panel reset in its frame and left closed because it had served its purpose and could now simply be what it appeared to be. Grayson could see the silhouette of his son against the curtain sitting at the small desk they'd brought from the apartment bent over something. The Merit Energy Foundation would take time to build correctly. He had already begun talking with Weston about the structure, a nonprofit arm, to manage the charitable installations, a separate commercial entity for the paying customers, with pricing set at levels that kept the technology within reach of the families it had always been designed to serve. The first systems would go to people in eastern Kentucky, in the counties where power bills were highest and incomes were lowest, where a machine that generated free electricity was not an abstraction but a direct and concrete change in the specific daily weight of a specific life. Eugenia Pratt would be first. He had already told her so, and she had said only that she hoped the installation wouldn't take too long because winter was coming, and she'd been meaning to get an electric mattress pad for the past 3 years. After a while, the light in Owen's window went dark. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, the wood stove ticking as it cooled the workshop, humming its steady, constant note behind him. Grayson went inside. He checked the stove, added a piece of wood, adjusted the damper. He walked through the rooms of the farmhouse the way he had learned to walk through it, knowing where the floor spoke underfoot, knowing where the draft came through the gap at the kitchen window. He still needed to seal, knowing the distance from the hallway to Owen's door without counting steps. He stopped outside Owen's room and listened. The quiet breathing of a child who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The particular silence of a house that had been given back its purpose. He stood there in the dark hallway of Clifford Merritt's farmhouse in Harlan County, Kentucky, in a November that had begun with him standing at a diner sink at midnight and arrived somehow here, and he felt something he recognized after a moment as the specific weight of things being in their right place. Not happiness exactly, something older than happiness, something more durable. The feeling of a man who has carried something important through difficult ground and has set it down exactly where it was meant to go. He went to his room. Outside, the ridge trees moved in the cold wind, their bare branches tracing the dark sky. The workshop held its steady note. The stars above Harlan County burned the way they had always burned, ancient and indifferent, and on certain nights clarifying. In the morning, there would be work to do. There was always work to do. He knew the tools, knew the notes, knew the land. The right hands were ready.